Few people were standing by the open casket. Only a handful of people showed up to the funeral. The fingers of 2 hands would be enough to count them, all standing nearby in a nearby parking lot, sitting. 2 guys seemed eager to bid farewell to the deceased. When the last person left the cemetery, they got out of the car and the deceased's brother hurriedly announced that everything was ready to go to the house for the celebration. Then, he invited everyone to a funeral dinner. Some women insisted that you have to wait until the coffin is lowered into the grave to throw a handful of dirt, they told John. The man was sobbing and restless on the spot. He didn't want people to see that he had agreed to participate in some experiment. It was indecent to drive everyone out of the cemetery, and he would have to explain what 2 young men would do now with the coffin. It was simple. Their task was to install a camera inside the deceased's coffin. John was uncomfortable telling people that he had decided to make money off his dead sister. So, he remained silent about the monetary reward, and the young scientist who installed the camera explained that this was a scientific study. It was clear that they were there at ease with the brother's decision to help science, and no one condemned him. "Everything's ready! Bring the lid when the camera installation is done," one of the scientists instructed the brother, covering his mouth with his hand. Meanwhile, they twisted 2 screws and lowered the coffin into the grave using some ropes. John wiped away his tears and took a handful of soil. "I'm sorry! My condolences," a man said, placing his hand on John's shoulder. John looked at him with a confused expression. He didn't know anyone. He rarely spoke to his sister, and was only sure of one thing: she had no family or husband with whom she would have had a close relationship. Minutes later, the grave was covered with soil, and the mysterious man stood there watching the burial. He remained close to John until he decided to share his memories. The sister's brother listened to the old man. "Why do you think I'm interested in these conversations? My sister was 8 years older than me. We had no common interests," John said impetuously. "If it weren't for her sudden death, then I wouldn't have delved deeper into her life," the old man replied. Now John's thoughts were on something else. "My sister was a very good person, although I didn't have direct contact with her very often. She left all her belongings to a nursing home," John continued. Deep down, this even irritated John, as he had to organize a funeral, collect all the documents, and arrange a celebration. The deceased brother added, "That nursing home even bears her name now, did you know that?" On the day of her death, John went to visit Emma and found her sleeping on the couch. Soon, he realized that she wasn't breathing and panicked. "Is she really dead? It can't be," he thought, distressed. 20 minutes later, the ambulance team confirmed that the woman was dead. John didn't know what to do, so he went with her to the hospital, as he had never experienced something like this before. The doctors told him that the woman would be sent for an autopsy to determine the cause of death. John was lost and had never imagined that his visit would end up like this. He asked to skip the procedure, but was explained that the rules could not be violated. If a person did not suffer from any disease, the autopsy was mandatory. The brother remembered that his sister had complained about her heart, informed the doctors, and they discovered that the woman did have a heart problem. However, only a pathologist can determine the exact cause of death. So, the elderly gentleman had no choice but to agree, but 2 boys helped. For several days they had been looking for volunteers who would agree to the experiment, as they cannot arbitrarily perform any experiment on a corpse. They needed the mandatory consent of relatives of someone who had passed away, and until now, they hadn't found any. So, this brother and sister were the perfect option for them. John, with regret, informed them that a pathologist would soon take care of his sister, but in the end, these young scientists convinced the doctors that there was no need for an autopsy. After discussing the diagnosis of the deceased, they concluded that the death was indeed due to heart pathology. The elderly man was happy that his sister's death must not have been so painful. She must have had a heart attack, and in seconds, her heart simply stopped beating. John was certain that if his sister had the opportunity to express her opinion, she would prefer to be buried intact. After talking to the boys, he accepted the scientist's proposal. His conscience still haunted him, though. He agreed to put a video camera in the coffin, but did not violate any of God's commandments. He thought, "I cannot bring my sister back, but the extra money will not harm anyone." Of course, it was the reward that made him agree to this offer. The participation fee for this experiment was high, so with his sister's death, not only sadness but also joy emerged. On the same day the cameras were installed in the coffin, he received a transfer of $15,000. John couldn't believe it. In the end, the scientists were, in fact, keeping their word. He received a reward so quickly. This gift was so good, especially after he found out at the funeral that his sister gave her money to some random old people. Later, it turned out there was a reason why the brother didn't like that talkative woman at the funeral. The man was an employee of a nursing home. John imagined he was probably trying to get close to his lonely sister to take the house she had built. In the end, he decided not to worry about it. He hadn't thought about it before, and now there was no reason to be upset. It's just how it goes. You win some, you lose some. With the scientists, it turned out to be even more profitable. The experiment that John agreed to was very simple. He didn't want to know the results. It was too unpleasant. So the scientists had to observe the decomposition of the body. The battery that powered that camera would last about a year. The camera wouldn't be on all day. It would automatically turn on once a day, for exactly 1 minute at 10 p.m. It would record what was happening and then turn off again. Those were the details the scientists gave. He thought about how that experiment could improve his living conditions and maybe even make a trip to Paris. John was under 60 years old and still had every right to dream. After the funeral, John went home. Finally, he could completely forget about his sister. Fortunately, they never got close. He wouldn't suffer much for her. The scientists would have to take care of his sister for a year. The most interesting thing will be when all the data is collected, but first, they needed to make sure everything was working. Well, the two guys would impatiently wait for the camera to turn on every day to make sure everything was set up correctly. On that day, at night, they wanted to get home as quickly as possible to see if everything was running correctly. On that first day, they saw something strange. So they rewound the tape for 1 minute, over and over again, to make sure they saw what they saw. They discussed the video, trying to find a logical explanation for why this was happening. The body could have moved when it was lowered into the coffin, or when the lid was closed. In fact, there were few options, and neither could explain why the body was not as it was at the funeral. The hands were on the head, and the body itself was bent as if the woman was trying to get out of the coffin. The guys just found it very strange and were shocked. They decided to run to the cemetery and dig up the grave. They didn't think twice. They did everything themselves. Getting permission to dig would probably take time, and if they found out their assumptions were correct, every minute mattered. They found out their decision was right. The woman in the coffin was alive. Emma needed the help of doctors. Urgently. When they opened the coffin, the woman was almost out of energy. She took a deep breath and began to tell who was responsible for her death. After arriving at the nearest hospital and receiving all medical assistance, Emma reported that her half-brother had poisoned her. On that day, John went to visit him and started saying that he wanted to borrow his diamonds. John was Emma's half-brother. When she was 15 years old, her father married a woman who had a young son. The half-brother was 10 years old and he was a very peculiar child. He was jealous of his mother and threw dramatic tantrums. The father, at the time, ignored his new son's bad behavior just because he loved his wife. Emma soon started living alone and never got close to John. Her father was a rich man. He had a strange hobby, however. He collected diamonds. With his death, much later, he left his collection to his only legitimate daughter. Emma considered this attitude quite fair. Furthermore, her father had never deprived John of anything either. A year later, John began to try to build a relationship with his half-sister. Emma thought that a man in his old age only wanted to get closer to his half-sister so that he wouldn't live so alone, but it was discovered that John had other interests. Somehow, he started talking about diamonds and his sister understood everything. The half-brother turned into a greedy old man who had been chasing money for 5 years, pressuring her and demanding that she at least split her inheritance equally. "Why does a lonely old woman need so much wealth? Her only hobby is sewing," John questioned on the day of the visit. His pension would be enough for him, she was sure. Emma didn't take him seriously, laughed, joked with him, saying, "Old man, why do you need diamonds at your age? Are you going to travel the world?" The old half-brother didn't bother her much. He visited her infrequently and talked about diamonds, basically. Always the same talk. She thought he wouldn't do anything bad, until that night, everything changed. On that day, at his apartment, John came to her in another visit, started talking about diamonds again, and said he was quite tired of these conversations. It would be better for her to voluntarily share the inheritance with him. They had coffee. Emma, as always, was joking around, and then she felt like she was falling asleep. Her brother soon helped her to go to the couch. She couldn't do anything with her eyes closed. As if it were a dream, she saw John searching for something around the room and realized that her half-brother had spiked her coffee to ransack the house. The elderly woman didn't expect such a dirty trick and, of course, didn't think her brother wanted to kill her. Then, she woke up in a coffin. Apparently, the brother went too far with sleeping pills. She actually had heart problems, and it was surprising that, after such a large dose of medication, she survived everything. Somehow, she was lucky. John didn't want to sacrifice his sister. He planned to find the diamonds and take them while his sister was asleep. Knowing his sister, she wouldn't go to the police, and if he did, he would strongly deny everything. But he didn't find any jewelry at home and tried to wake his sister up to force her to confess where she had hidden the diamonds, but she showed no signs of life. So he came up with this plan. He kept the glasses so no one would see that they had coffee together, and claimed to have discovered his sister's body when he entered the unlocked house. He ended up with nothing, but fortunately, no one suspected anything. Then these scientists appeared. Without thinking twice, he decided that he would at least receive something from his sister, agreeing to the experiment, and receiving a nice monetary reward. Finally, the elderly man sat at home and planned his luxurious trip. But when the doorbell rang, he was very surprised to see his deceased sister accompanied by police. The brother didn't think his sister was alive, and the fact that he was trying to profit from her death actually saved her life. Of course, John had to be punished for what he did, but at the insistence of the victim, he received a minimal sentence. Emma had not had diamonds for a long time. She did not need them for herself, and used the money from them for a greater good. It's good that she helped children with oncology. It's a pity that her brother had to spend some time in a cell because of this inheritance, instead of taking the desired trip, but greed leads to nothing good. It's better to have little but honestly earn than to try to obtain money from others. Emma continued to enjoy sewing and did not understand why people wanted such great luxury. For her, life's greatest riches cannot be bought with money.